Okay, we're good. It says that it's live streaming. So, welcome to the second of two panels celebrating Engels' 200th birthday, hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Societies chapter in Manchester, UK. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to sort of set the scene and give a brief introduction to proceedings today. So I'm Mike Atkinson, PhD candidate at the University of Brighton and co-pedagogue, along with Liam Grogan, for the Platypus Manchester chapter. I'll be moderating this second panel, Tenants Organising in the 2020s. Just some brief information about Platypus. The Platypus Affiliated Society was established in December 2006. It's a project of critique in education concerned with exploring the improbable, but not impossible, reconstitution of emancipatory Marxian left out of the possibility of revolutionary politics with the goal of human freedom. Our slogan is, "The left is dead, long live the left." So we're located at universities internationally, and at each university and across different chapters, we organise reading groups, panel discussions, research and journalism. And here in the University of Manchester, we run a weekly reading group, which is on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. and our informal coffee breaks on Fridays at 5 p.m. Everyone's welcome to join. These currently take place on Zoom for obvious reasons. And the information can be found on the Platypus website. We've got Facebook pages and there's a student union page as well. And if you're at the University of Manchester and you want to come to the reading group, I would encourage you to join the society. Not join, you don't have to join Platypus itself, but join the society. It makes it easier for us to keep in touch with you. So moving on to the panel discussion at hand now, I'm going to read out the panel description and the question that we're posing to the panelists today. In recent years, housing has again returned to become a focus for organising, and several new efforts at organising tenants have emerged on the left. This comes at the moment of failure for the Corbynism movement and neo-social democratic politics. It appears that this may be a transitional moment for the left, implicating a shift in political strategy away from a policy orientation and towards community organising. Furthermore, the pandemic response has foregrounded the importance of adequate housing and has heightened attempts to build solidarity at a grassroots level. At this moment of resurgent tenants organising, therefore, we ask, how does organising tenants' unions relate to renewing revolutionary politics and the task of overthrowing capitalism? Now, given the fact that we evidently only have two panelists for this discussion, each of you will be able to give your opening remarks, after which we'll open the floor to questions in order to facilitate a more relaxed conversational discussion. I'm therefore going to encourage attendees who wish to ask questions to do so quite quickly, along with the conversation, such that the questions can be put forward and the discussion moves along at a pace. The whole duration should be no more than 1.5 to 2 hours. So just some brief remarks about doing that. So it's webinar-like, but that bit more informal. Please keep your audio and video muted unless you're speaking. Obviously, the panelists can keep their videos on. Please send your questions by chat to Katrina. She's under the name Platypus Manchester. You don't need to write out the question in full, just a sentence on what you want to talk about. That'll probably be easier. Katrina can pass your questions along to me. She can read them, I can read them out. Or if you wish, I can call you up. You can unmute, put your video on if you like, and ask your question yourself. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers who graciously joined us today. We have Dr. Quintin Bradley, who's in planning and housing at Leeds Beckett University. Dr. Quintin Bradley is a senior lecturer, I should have said, in planning and housing at Leeds Beckett University, and leads a research programme into neighbourhood and community planning with a particular focus on public engagement in questions of housing supply and housing allocations. His published work deals with issues of popular contention in planning and housing and the role of social movements in urban policy. He's the joint editor of Localism and Neighbourhood Planning, Power to the People, published by Policy Press in January 2017, and is the author of The Tenants Movement, published by Routledge in 2015. Imogen Woods works with the Prometheus journal, and she's a trade union organiser that's been organising in social care for the past 2 years. She's also an editor for Prometheus. It's an online socialist journal, and she's interested in the relationship, and Prometheus is interested in the relationship between social reproduction theory and social movement trade unionism. So without further ado, Dr. Bradley, if you would like to present your opening remarks.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike. Thanks for the introduction. I want to talk about the role of social movements in housing rights. I'm going to show you some slides, so if you just bear with me and give me a shout, Mike, when you can see the slides, please. So,
yeah, it's on mine.
Lovely, thanks very much. So I think a lot of people are thinking about an anniversary these days, and it's 10 years since the student protests against the introduction of tuition fees and the beginning of a mass movement around housing rights. But it's also another anniversary of the day that global capital decided to move into the rental sector, having wrecked the world's economy, speculating on high-risk mortgages. So the world of renting has changed fundamentally in 10 years, with private equity companies buying up vast amounts of rental property across Europe and America and across the globe. So we have a global housing crisis, a conflict between the right to housing, the right to have a home, and speculation with housing as an asset. And nowhere has that been more apparent than in student accommodation, particularly in purpose-built student accommodation, which it seems to me whetted the appetite of global capital. So tuition fees meant debt, meant credit, meant the possibility of jacking up rents. And private equity funds have followed suit, still investing copiously in student accommodation, with Blackstone, one of the most famous of these companies, buying IQ over summer, not at all concerned about COVID-19. So where do we go from the rent strikes in student accommodation? Where do we go from mobilization of young people, given that housing is a global crisis that just appears to be getting worse? So we could look for inspiration to Berlin right now and the introduction of a rent cap. We could look for inspiration to Catalonia and the amazing things that are happening there. Or we could go back to our own history, our history of rent strikes. So the rent strikes before and during the First World War, ending in the Clydeside rent strike from these pictures here, that won a rent cap in the private rented sector that lasted up until 1965 and that was still in place until near the end of Thatcher's reign. And of course, that also was responsible, or largely responsible, for the birth of council housing. Or the mass squatting of army camps and of luxury empty mansions in the West End of London in 1945 as armed services families without any homes forced the Labour government and Naira and Bevan to begin their mass council house building programme. And council housing had its own public. Council housing would not have existed if it hadn't been for an organised people, for a social movement that created it and then maintained its values. And these tenant struggles fought to maintain an idea of municipal housing or public housing as a tenure of choice, as a universal option. So the 1972 national rent strike, in which tenants and the industrial working class fought against the Ted Heath government and their imposition of market rents into council housing. So this was the beginning of the residualization of council housing. Rents went up, and if you couldn't afford them, you claimed housing benefit. And then we saw then the beginning of council housing as a safety net rather than a tenure of choice. And tenants fought against that process the whole way through. So here against housing action trusts in the late 1980s, against compulsory competitive tendering of council housing in the 1990s, and against the transfer of housing to housing associations, and the bulldozing of whole estates in the 2000s, continuing today. So I'm focusing on council housing because I think this is a fundamental issue. This chart is really famous. I'm sure everybody's seen it, but what most people don't talk about is the little red line here. And you can see the effect that the stopping of council house building, so the end of supply, the privatization of council housing through right to buy, and the bulldozing of council housing estates. So we've lost 120,000 council homes since 2004 to the bulldozer. See the effect that had on house prices. So they were going along quite steadily when we had a mass council housing sector. We were building 100,000 council homes every year. And it's only when council housing becomes residualized that house price inflation takes off. So essential to turning housing from a home into a capital, into an asset, was destroying the alternative, was getting rid of council housing. And that has made house prices and rents the speculative territory for global capital. But one other thing, a more positive thing, I think has happened through the residualization of council housing, in that there is no longer any firm barriers between council tenants who are active in tenants and residents associations and national organizations, homeless campaigns, and campaigns in the private sector, because it is possible to lose your council home, be homeless, and then be housed in the private rented sector, and to be in a spiral between them. So in this potential to join forces across tenures, I think there is the beginnings of hope. And I also kind of would suggest that this is the strategy that we should be pursuing. So while student rent strikes are getting the headlines right now, and incredible courageous actions, we see the potential for a broad-based mass movement on housing rights, and it needs to be across all housing tenures. So the renters' unions that are setting up, we need to forge links between them and between the student rent strikes, and between them and what's left of the organised council and housing associations, social housing tenants. And that it needs to be international. We need to look for inspiration across the globe, because this is affecting everybody. So I would end with that. Let's look back to our past. And just as we're thinking about a 10-year anniversary, let's think about going back to the future. Thank you very much indeed. I'll just try to stop sharing. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bradley. Imogen, would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I wanted to talk about something a little bit different. So I wanted to talk about the relationship, or rather the potential relationship between housing organising and the trade union movement. So by day, I'm a trade union organiser, but I actually cut my teeth as an organiser, as a community organiser with Acorn, so within housing. And so I came to some conclusions about the importance of the cohesion of both community and trade union organising as essential to building class power and class consciousness to win concrete material things for our class, and situating it in a class struggle that is political. So yeah, let's be honest, in the wake of huge electoral defeat, with the defeat of Corbynism, the economic crisis that's happened under the COVID pandemic, let alone the housing crisis, we need to do some really smart strategic organising to rebuild class consciousness. So the left has even the slightest possibility of winning. So a strategy that I'm really interested in is this idea of bargaining for the common good. So bargaining for the common good is a strategy that can be traced back to the 1930s Communist Party in America. It's nothing new. But bargaining for the common good is the idea that trade unions should make demands beyond the workplace. So not just about wages or material conditions, but things that meet the interests of our class as a whole. So that can be things like better funding for schools, more funding for healthcare, and it can also encompass things like better housing. So this is most commonly used within public sector unionism, and this is used to unite the interests of both workers and the people that utilise those services to build maximum power and win big changes. And it's, I think, an absolutely essential piece to the puzzle of how we can win for working class people using the most powerful tool that we have as the working class, which is the ability to withdraw our labour, to be able to strike. So when organisers or people organising within the trade union movement think about planning a campaign, we think about several different things, and that's having an industrial strategy, a political strategy, and a community strategy. And particularly when it comes to sort of public sector unionism, winning in the struggles is not reliant on interrupting private profits, you know, not wholly reliant on that, but actually the point of production in those struggles is the community. And housing is something that appeals to, you know, is an issue that appeals to the interests of so many workers, and, you know, can be useful to engage people in workers' struggle in such a period of low-class struggle and with such a weak labour movement that we have currently. Because, you know, what's the point in campaigning for better wages if all those wages are going to be siphoned off to a private landlord? It doesn't make much sense. And currently, you know, the situation in the labour movement at the minute in terms of community organising, it largely relies on sort of weak ties with NGO organisations and community leaders, rather than seeing the community as absolutely integral to workplace struggle for the success of those struggles. So I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about some tangible examples about how housing has linked in with labour struggles. And I want to look across the pond to America, where there's been some really incredible teacher strikes in the past couple of years. So in 2018, there was a strike wave that took hold of schools across America. There were strikes that took place in Arizona, in Oklahoma, West Virginia, and LA. And most of those strikes were illegal. And demands within those strikes weren't just about wages, they were about things like smaller class sizes for kids. They were about having more nurses on campus, having better healthcare for the kids. And even in Oklahoma and West Virginia, they even included demands around taxing coal and oil companies higher to pay for school funding. And in the Chicago teachers' strike, housing was an absolutely central demand to that. As they said, in Chicago, there was over 18,000 school kids that were homeless, and it was also a massive issue that affected teachers. Some of them even reported that they were sleeping in their cars. So this was an issue that was really affecting teachers deeply, you know, just as much as issues around wages. And, you know, these rank and file uprisings, they happened not because some union bureaucrat came along and said, you know, we're going to put a pay claim in for better wages, but it's because workers were seen as not just economic units, but as whole people that have, you know, multifaceted issues. And also that they fundamentally really care about the students. You know, if you're organising in the public sector, the thing that the boss is going to come for you with is that if you go on strike, you're affecting your service users. Well, if you encompass demands saying, you know, we want to stop homelessness for students, you cut right through that. you stop that rhetoric in its tracks, and you say, well, actually, we're striking not just because we want better wages or conditions for ourselves, but we want better conditions for the people that we care about on a daily basis. So after an 11-day all-out strike, they not only won demands around their wages, but they also won more support for the homeless students. And similarly, in the teacher strikes in LA, housing was also on the agenda. The union proposed, plans to the city for new affordable housing. And even though during contract negotiations, that it wasn't agreed to at that time, a few months later, the city agreed to implement some of their plans. And these teacher strikes had a huge input from the DSA, which is an organisation in America that was part of supporting the Bernie Sanders campaign. They actually advocate, there's an article on the DSA website that advocates for socialists to become teachers so they can be part of these kind of struggles to organise within their workplaces towards similar means. And in West Virginia, the West Virginia strikes, some of the worker leaders that were integral to the campaign, they were part of the DSA. So in the UK, where the labour movement, quite frankly, is quite weak, it might seem like a bit of a pipe dream that, we're going to go on these big all-out strikes and make demands, beyond the workplace. But actually, if we're thinking strategically, some of the biggest employers in the UK are public sector. And there's been uproar, particularly during COVID. People are agitated. The pay offer in universities for this year is 0%. There's a public sector pay freeze. Loads of NHS staff have been on marches campaigning for a pay rise. We've seen teachers in the NEU getting involved in a campaign. They had a meeting with 20,000 teachers, which is huge. And there's seen like a massive increase in reps during this pandemic. So if we're going to be smart as a socialist left, if we don't want to repeat the same mistakes that we did in 2008 in this time of crisis, then we really need to see these groups of workers as incredibly strategic in going forward, and look at how relate the issues that beyond just wages and the housing crisis that we're currently facing, and see a strike weapon as absolutely integral to that. Anyway, so that's sort of my chat about bargaining for the common good and how we can integrate both housing struggles and sort of social movement unionism. But I just wanted to leave on a note to talk a little bit about Prometheus. So Prometheus is a new journal that started during lockdown, and it's a group of a few sort of socialists. We've been organising sort of informally together for a little while, and yeah, we started the journal when we were all stuck in our houses. But I guess it's sort of an anti-Stalinist journal that you sort of is arguing for the necessity of a party towards socialism and not just reformism. And it's a place where we're trying to sort of engage and think through some ideas and strategies for the future.
Thank you very much, Imogen, and thank you to you both. I want to open this up now for you both to respond to one another, and also to questions that are going to come in. I want to sort of, I'm collecting my own thoughts from everything that you've both said as well. I want to sort of open this up by saying myself what I gleaned from what you both said as a sort of a common thread that ran through them both. There seemed to be a kind of a lament. Obviously, they're going to be given what they're about, but Dr. Bradley, you talked about that we should look to the past, back to the future, I think you said. Imogen, you were saying about how class consciousness seems to be at an all-time low. Labour movement doesn't seem to be happening. So this lament from you both seems to stretch back into the past. And Imogen, just as you finished up, then you were talking about the necessity of a party, which isn't actually something I hear a lot from socialists these days. And I just wondered if you could both say something to that, to one another as well. What would the link be between, say, organising these strikes, organising movements in workplaces, things like that? How do you get from that to a more mass movement, a broader movement based on, I suppose you could say very briefly, more general principles, more generally trying to get beyond these crises, trying to get beyond capitalism, etc. So I thought, feel free to ignore that for the moment, respond to one another, etc., and come back to that. However you guys both want to do it is totally fine. I'm gonna just for the sake of organising it, I'm going to ask Dr. Bradley if you want to come in and start just by responding to Imogen, and then you can both sort of unmute and respond to one another, and the questions will come in. Is that okay? Yeah.
Yes. Thanks very much, Mike. Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Imogen's really put a finger on it. Nothing will ever be gained without organising in the workplace and organising in the community. And it's the withdrawal of labour, the strategic withdrawal of labour, which throughout the history of rent strikes has made them into a fearsome weapon. I don't want to dwell on history because everything has changed so much, but I'll give you some examples. The 1891 dock strike is for they teach it in school, but that's a rent strike plus the withdrawal of labour in the dockyards. And from that, a whole socialist strategy was mapped out based around the general strike and the workers' occupation of the community. So basically closing off the community to the police, the sort of things we've been seeing recently in North America, of course. And then obviously from the council housing comes out of the withdrawal of labour in the shipyards and the armaments factories of Clydeside and the Clydeside rent strike. So that's absolutely right as a strategy, and clearly all the obstacles we're very aware of them. The power of labour, the power of community organising. We need to be aware of that. But I think what Imogen's also putting a finger on is the role of the home as the place of social reproduction, but its role in the production of a workforce. And what's interesting, I think, what has been interesting is that the sort of establishment response, if I can use that word, the establishment response to COVID, in focusing attention on the role of the home in health and well-being generally, has been interesting because they have no intention of doing anything about it, but they very rarely, so planning white paper, social housing white paper, you get Boris Johnson, talking about the need for greenery, the need for public space, the need for space standards. No intention of doing anything about that, but we can work on that because that reinforces the role of the home, not just as a kind of retreat from the world, but as the beginning of society. And without adequate standards in the home, then society itself collapses. So, building on that means insisting on, decent space standards. Building on that means, getting more planning regulation, not less, as they intend. But I think building on that also means talking again about social need. And as Imogen said, the idea that we share needs, that as a society, there are some things that we can actually pinpoint and say, everybody has to have this, a minimum standard of this. And if that's housing, that's space, that's greenery, that's air, light, the things that actually people are being radically deprived of. We really need to focus attention onto that idea. And there's such a long way to go. And I was struck, you know, in the last election that many people were beginning to sort of like start a new process of education. Like, let's talk about the history of trade union activism, you know, as if it was something new, which of course it is for so many people. But we need to talk about something that we can actually all recognize. And I think the idea of social need, of basic needs, of human rights, I think human rights have now become a very, very forceful tool. You know, we're not, because we have lost so many, and yet to campaign for human rights reminds us that we are human, that we share humanity, and that we are, you know, we are a society, we are a collective. We're not, you know, just individuals all out for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley. Imogen, if you'd like to come back to that, and then we do have a question lined up. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think absolutely. There are basic needs that people have that aren't being met, and as socialists, you know, we need to struggle over those, you know, for more green space, for adequate housing. Some of the private rental sector properties that you see are completely horrendous. You know, when I've been door knocking for Acorn, there's like slug infestations, you know, people don't have working cookers, all these sort of things, but having a merger between those issues and you know, labour issues, I think is essential to moving those forward. I mean, one sort of concrete, there was a housing strike in not housing strike, housing workers strike in Manchester in 2017, I believe. Mears housing workers who were doing the maintenance on those properties. They were campaigning for better wages, for equitable wages, for because they were being paid less than other companies in Manchester that were contracted by the council. But part of their strategy was door knocking tenants and talking to them about their issues and getting them on board and saying, well, actually, you know, your interests as tenants are very much mirrored with our interests in terms of, you know, providing a better service for you.
Thank you, Imogen. Okay, so we have a question now for you both from David Mountain. David, if you'd like to unmute, you can put your camera on if you like, etc. And go ahead.
Yeah. Hello, thanks very much for the presentations. I'm David. I moderated the previous panel that happened earlier in the afternoon about Engels and the housing question. I've kind of got two questions. The first is just to kind of like bring in some more of the Engels related questions, remembering that we're here on the 200th anniversary of his birth and his critique of both liberal reformist and anarchist approaches to the housing question. So I'd be interested if you could both comment a bit more on how you read that, what and also what lessons we could learn from that in the present. And then the other part of the question, or maybe a separate question really, I kept kind of thinking about Boris Johnson's government today, and you know that there's a lot of it seems like he's trying to mark quite a sort of historical kind of transitionary moment, especially when it comes to the planning system. It seems to me that after decades of not building houses, as was shown in the graph shown by Dr. Bradley, mainly under, or quite significantly under the new Labour government, that like Johnson and Johnson's cabinet are really trying to kind of liberalise the planning system and to encourage more house building. And obviously I know like there's a lot of, we could bring up a lot of problems with this around the likelihood that like there's not very many regulations on the quality of the housing, etc. Then we might get really poorly planned cities with lots of congestion, all these kinds of things. but it might not be that different to, say, the moment of the 1930s and this kind of interwar moment of like mass speculation, speculative property development that really did provide a lot of housing for a lot of people who wanted suburban housing. And there was a lot of kind of, I'm rambling a bit too much, but like there was a lot of kind of from the intelligentsia of the 1930s, there was a lot of resistance to the suburbs of metro land, of northwest London, of this kind of like sprawling, endless suburbia. And there's a kind of feeling of like a threat of natural England, of the countryside. And hence you get like a strengthening of greenbelt regulation around the moment of the Second World War. But we can't deny that those kind of like suburban housing was really popular, and that like it did satisfy a need for a wide range of people at that time. And so don't get me, I'm not trying to sort of advocate anything particularly positive, but I just want to like raise this problem of like Boris Johnson's government's turn towards house building, and how you'd both respond to that.
Whoever would like to go first, it's totally up to you.
I'll go first.
Yeah.
So the first question about Engels and about kind of, I suppose, the accusation that housing cooperatives are bourgeois. So I think the ideal is to take housing out of the commodity system entirely. How you go about that, of course, is another question. One of the things that strikes me is that we need a very coherent and inspiring vision. We need to be saying this is the sort of housing and the sort of society that goes with it that we want, and that needs to be quite a practical vision. And I was talking about council housing in my talk because I think you do need a substantial alternative to the private rental sector and to home ownership. So Boris Johnson's government at the moment is promoting home ownership as the only a thing that people should aspire to. And yet, unless you have, a substantial alternative that is thoroughly regulated, so which has, regulated rents and regulated building standards and management standards, then you just get soar away price inflation in both rented and home ownership sectors, and a decline in conditions and the sort of things that we're seeing today. As Imogen said, that people just living in boot cupboards, the people celebrating, the adaptation of offices and shops into homes without the need for planning permission, despite the fact that you're living in a shoebox. So I think, the idea of taking housing outside the commodity system is one thing, but also we need to build on kind of the models of the past. And the trouble, I suppose, with council housing is that we cannot kind of disassociate that from all the stigma that's going to be smeared all over it over decades and decades. Things like cooperative housing do inspire people, but they've also got, deep roots in the past. So it's co-partnership housing was kind of was the new working class alternative to home ownership that, was pioneered by the Garden City movement. So it was the first workers' cooperative housing, and it was really popular, but it was kind of killed off by council housing. And, the municipal or public, building of something on kind of paternalist lines does kind of crush that spirit. So I think we need to work on what the housing that we would actually like as a substantial alternative really looks like. So that's one thing. I mean, going to the issue of house building, the situation is this, right? So the dominant narrative is that we need more homes because if we build more full price market homes, the price of homes will fall down. the evidence to support that is extraordinarily marginal. There might be a very small decrease in the upward rate of house prices. House prices have gone up by 160% in the last 20 years. If you build, 300,000 homes a year for 20 years, then you might get a fall of 8%. So you're going to have an increase of 160% and a fall of 8%. Now that's not really worth the price of building an awful lot of homes that people can't afford and that nobody actually really wants. We don't actually need more full price market homes. We need more affordable homes. There are 4 million households right now who are in statutorily defined housing needs. So that's a 1995 Housing Act. You can just read it off. There's no question about they need homes and they need social rented homes. Only social rented homes provide homes that are affordable and they're at a good standard and a good standard of management. So, the demands that we should be having is, one social rented tenancy for the entire rented sector. There should be no difference in quality and standards and regulation between the social housing sector and the private housing sector. And if private landlords can't stand up to that, then they will be outcompeted because social housing is a much better offer. We need to stop the residualization of social housing and have a real functioning alternative. That means, you don't have to aspire for home ownership and settle for something pathetic like shared ownership, which isn't ownership in any way. You can actually, be proud to be a tenant. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley. Imogen?
Yeah, so in terms of the Engels question and the question of housing cooperatives, I mean, I think I don't know how radical housing cooperatives are, but I know that they're a particularly useful way of housing people that works in this present time in terms of the progression of a socialist movement through housing cooperatives. I'm very uncertain about, but it does alleviate a lot of the issues that come with the private rented sector. But what we really need to be campaigning or moving towards is a fundamental change in how housing works within, well, globally, rather than sort of just patching up some of the problems through cooperative housing. And I don't know if I can answer the question on regulation and housing around Boris Johnson.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Imogen.
Could I follow up maybe?
Yeah, of course, David.
I'm just interested in if Imogen would like to elaborate a tiny bit more on her reservations about cooperative housing.
Yeah, so I mean, if we want to implement systematic change in the way how the value system works within capital, small intermittent changes around cooperative housing, alleviating some of the issues for individuals through cooperative housing schemes, I don't think is really getting to the core issue of what the what's going on, and I think a lot more sort of strategic intervention would be a class struggle intervention. I think something the most powerful thing about sort of tenant or worker organising is putting people into conflicts with their boss or their landlord, and that process is really transformational. Like being in a room full of workers when they've just won a strike and they've been in this like dirty fight with their boss, like it's the most incredible thing that you've ever seen in your life. And it's people realizing their own power. And if you're you know, ironing over these issues by being like, oh, we'll create a solution like cooperative housing. You know, you're not getting into this dirty fight that creates this class consciousness, that is like one of the most effective political education tools that we have as socialists. And yeah.
Thank you, Imogen. Okay, we have another few questions have come through now. I've got an order in which to do these in my head, but this is I think it's gonna work quite well, fingers crossed. Okay, so this is a question from Liam Grogan. He wants to ask, how do you reconcile the fact that trade union and community organising manifests itself in demands for reforms from the state, which are easily then taken up by parties such as the Labour Party as political strategies to earn votes and win elections, resulting in the concentration of any power built assimilating into a party which, as history indicates, isn't actually interested in overcoming capitalism? And again, whoever would like to go first is totally fine.
Yeah, so I think inherently trade unions and community unions are reformist organisations, and are going to have reformist demands, and that's fine. That's the limits of those kind of organisations. But if you're organising groups of people that have never that you know, don't go to political reading groups, aren't part of a Socialist Party or the Labour Party, and you're organising them based on what they're interested in, what they care about, and you're taking them through this process. There's this process where people go from being angry about a particular issue, that their housing is shit, or that, you know, they can't afford, you know, basic necessities, and you take them through this process of you know, coming together with their colleagues or other people in a housing block, and get them to fight their boss, to go, you know, like march on their boss with a petition with a bunch of colleagues, and like see how much power that they have together, and that they can win something tangible. Like, that's what it's about. And sure, you get some reformist like wins along the way, and that's great. That's not the thing that a socialist like should be the end goal. It should be this transformational process that people go through when they are in struggle. Unions have like huge problems with bureaucracies, and like I'm sure with new emerging tenants unions, that's going to be a problem. But if workers or tenants get taught how to fight their bosses or their landlords, then they're also going to know how to fight the unions. Like a strike or a rent strike is like excellent training ground in how to have a dirty fight. So, yeah.
Thank you, Imogen. Dr. Bradley.
Well, I completely agree there. You know, so Imogen's talking about the collective empowerment that comes through strike action. And I mean, I would also say that residents who take over the management of their neighborhood, their estate, or I mean, you know, I suppose I differ slightly from Imogen in that the collective empowerment that comes from setting up things like housing cooperatives or building your own homes, building a housing cooperative. What we're talking about, I think what we're both talking about, is a learning process and a process of confidence building, and of also of seeing the world in a very different way, of seeing the world in a way in which you feel capable of changing it. And all the people, you know, so many people that I talk to who are in community groups and community action and tenants groups and residents groups. And that's one of the things that they always say, that they kind of, you know, they talk about a change, a transition from being kind of passive and receiving things and thinking that things have to be this way, to asking questions and then to seeing the potential for change. And it's, I can't stand somebody saying, this is reformism, or, that you should set up a revolutionary party, for God's sake. People, are very complicated, and they can have lots of completely different ideas in their head at the same time, and it's only from people that change will come. You can't say, right, you're not doing it enough. It's from people, and it's that learning process, and that's that process of inspiration. So people, the best thing we can do is offer hope, is offer vision, is offer inspiration, and help people on that journey so that they discover their own capabilities, and that they acquire their own confidence and their own ability to bring about radical change.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley. We have a question now from Anthony Melafopoulos. I'm sorry, Anthony, if I pronounced your surname wrong there. Anthony says, Quintin and Imogen seem to be viewing the housing issue in a different way. Perhaps this could be characterized in terms of Imogen advocating for the need for a defensive strategy led by public sector workers. Quintin, in contrast, points to that investment in housing is a driving edge of capitalism. How might a strategy around housing move from being defensive about what is being lost, for example, public sector unionism, public housing, to what is coming into view? I'm going to ask Dr. Bradley if you want to take this one first, just because there's a question coming up which is directed to you, and I'd just like to vary it a bit.
Okay, well, that's a tough one, isn't it? So I was listening to, I don't know if anyone listens to Pushback Talks, which is the former UN Special Rapporteur for the Universal Right to Adequate Housing. It's her kind of campaign vehicle. And she was talking about Berlin and the Berlin rent cap, which has been introduced by kind of referendum against the kind of wishes of the federal state. And that's because the large scale private equity companies have just moved into Berlin and bought overnight hundreds of thousands of apartments, and then started to jack up the rent. And so, Berlin political society has fought back and won, a very small victory. And the rent cap would last for 5 years. And you think, well, this is an example of kind of defensive reformism, isn't it? But is it? Because, it's a big slap in the face to Blackstone and Swedish companies and and all the other companies that are pouring in there. And it shows the potential for links between, the tenants who are at the cutting edge of that, and the academics who did the research, and the economists who kind of won the argument that rent strikes will destroy the market and stuff like that. So that it was the kind of focus of a bipartisan and collective movement that crossed class boundaries and crossed lots of boundaries and ethnic boundaries. So she was saying in Berlin, you would have no idea who your landlord was, because there would be a trail of 60 companies. So, you could identify the first company, and it would just say company, number 122. And it would be owned by something else. And there would be 60 companies before you got to Blackstone at the end of that. And that would be kind of Blackstone registered in the Cayman Islands or something like that. You would have no way of knowing who your landlord was. So suppose you want to phone up your landlord, and you say, hey, my sink's leaking. Who are you going to get? They're going to rush out from the Cayman Islands straight away. Yeah, we'll be there in a minute. So this is the kind of, this is the situation we've got at the moment. How do you fight that? Well, we fight that by having a global housing, campaign, don't we? We've got to make those links. It's not the first time this has happened. Okay, this is, again, I know this sounds awful because it's going so far back in history, but municipal housing, social housing, was won in every single country in Europe and America by a mass militant struggle. And in every one of those countries, it was the trade unions and it was the communities who were demanding that and who won it. And we kept that going for generations. And it, in England, Britain, sorry, that council housing empowered generations and generations of working class people. Talk about social mobility. It was having a decent home at a fair rent that brought that about, and that's been destroyed. Okay, but we got it in the first place. We can get it. We can get things back. you know, we do need that global perspective. And we need to also, I think, you know, learn from the global south. You know, we tend to think about, you know, public services being something that are given to us, or, you know, maybe we deserve them. So we should look at informal settlements, informal planning, about people who are actually building public services from the bottom up with their bare hands, because they're the inspiration and they're the leaders, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley. Imogen.
Yeah, I'm gonna suggest that okay, like me and Quintin are perhaps suggesting slightly different strategies, but it's part of a diversity of strategies. And, you know, I absolutely agree with him that we do need a global perspective on the housing issue. I mean, and if you want to link that into public sector unionism and the privatization of that, and you look at how that's been financialized, these are the exact same people. Like, if you want to look into, I don't know, a care company that's been outsourced from the council, and you look and do the analysis on where the money, you follow the money and where it comes from, and it's going to be the exact same people that these corporate housing companies are. I mean, this sort of targeting of these companies is really important. If we look over to our comrades in Barcelona, and what came out of the anti-mortgage, when people were getting evicted from their houses in the 2008 financial crash, and were being evicted from their houses because of defaults on their mortgage payment. Now that movement has moved on since then, and it's gone more towards tenants union organising, and, you know, there's a big convergence of that movement and the union movement, because we're fighting the same people, and when those movements converge, that's when you have power. That's where you can really start to change things. And, you know, the global labour market it's not like it was in the 80s, where you've got one target and one boss, and like you fight them and that's it. You've got these huge multinational corporations that you've got to fight, so you've got to be bloody smart about it, because they're powerful.
Thank you, Imogen. I'm going to call upon Yong Zhang now to unmute himself, to put his camera on, etc. He's got a question that's actually, the conversation has sort of led towards this very nicely. Yong, are you around?
Sorry. Yes, I am.
Excellent.
Sorry, just had a shower, so it could be a bit messy. Maybe, all right. So, Dr. Bradley, thanks for your fantastic talk. I was actually kind of thrilled to hear you talking about human rights, because I feel like, you know, nowadays people seems to take it for granted that we don't have to take it seriously enough. But when we approach to the basic concepts of human rights, I cannot just stop thinking, to what extent do you think, you know, the housing issue in England is actually a global question rather than a local one? By which I mean, when you talk about human rights, I'm thinking there's a huge amount of population on the planet not even enjoying the decent housing, well, maybe you think is indecent here in England, right? So based on this fact, do you think we should spend more, if at least not less, effort to engage with the global community to solve this question, rather than take it as a local one to mobilize, you know, the tenants and landlords for a solution? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a really good point, that when we talk about human rights, I think the first people think about is the global south. And if we talk about the the universal right to adequate housing, which is quite a limited right, then people automatically think about slum housing. They think about informal settlements. They think about a lack of sewage and running water and clean water. They think about a lack of security. And if you look at the right as it's written in the United Nations Convention, it's a legal covenant that Great Britain has signed up to, and it's one of those funny ones because it doesn't give you the right to have a home, but it does mandate governments to implement policies that ensure that homes are safe and free from structural dangers, that they are affordable, and that they are secure and free from eviction. And when you look at that, you think, well, we haven't got that. We've got Grenfell Tower, people being burnt to death because their homes weren't adequately fire safe. And they weren't safe because people had, as they are admitting every week in the Grenfell inquiry, because they were exploiting and cutting corners and saving money and lying and falsifying fire safety tests. And we don't have affordable housing. We have housing which, even when it's cold, affordable housing is just slightly cheaper than whatever extortionate rents the market is charging. We don't have security. We have Section 21 evictions. We have evictions even when we're supposed to be not having evictions. We have a moratorium on evictions, and yet, they're just happening all around us. So
it's during COVID, you mean the moratorium?
I'm just thinking, yeah, in COVID, yeah. So I'm thinking, you're absolutely right that this is a global perspective and it's a global housing crisis. But as Imogen said, it's pretty much the same people, no matter which country you're in, who are causing and speculating and benefiting from this crisis. So, whatever opportunities we have for alliances, recognizing, as you say, the quantifiable differences between us, and recognizing our kind of our privileged position here, but also recognizing that there are universal rights that we as human beings should be claiming, and we should be recognizing and building on that we all have something in common because we all need a decent, secure and affordable home.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley. Imogen, if you would like to respond to Young's question as well, or to what Dr. Bradley has said, you're most welcome to.
I think I'm okay. I'm good.
Okay. David Mountain with another question. David, you're most welcome to again come in if you wish. Here we go.
Thanks. Yeah, just another question. Quintin, I know that you've done research on the South Wales Tenants Union in the 1970s, which I came across and found really interesting. And I've been really interested in this moment of history. And the reason I bring it up is because from reading articles by people involved in that moment of tenants organising in the 70s, you do get this perspective of how there was at that time a really palpable feeling that municipal socialism, that the left of the post-war national and local state, and in particular that council housing had really failed the public. And in a way, it's kind of like both, it's kind of despairing in a way, because like it really feels like they don't know which way to turn a little bit. And it seems to me that what they sort of imply is that a kind of renewed William Morrisian sort of late 19th century arts and crafts kind of socialism is the way of craft unionism, is kind of like the way forward. But it does sort of feel, reading that, like there's a real kind of dilemma about the fact that like social housing hasn't really emancipated people. Now, I know that you sort of, that's quite different to what you said earlier about the fact that social housing was like a victory of the working class, and that it, I don't remember exactly the words you used, but you said, and I don't disagree, that like social housing really like emancipated a lot of people, or it really like allowed a lot of people to have whole new opportunities, much better way of life than they had before. And I agree with that. But then I also agree, maybe this is off topic, but I also agree that the Chinese Communist Party in its urbanization program has like emancipated and improved the way of life for like millions and millions of people over the last few decades. But I can't say that I'm like a supporter of the Chinese Communist Party for political reasons. So I don't think it's as simple to say that like simply improving people's quality of life is necessarily like politically, well, it's a tricky one, because I guess it's definitely a good thing from a sort of like moral perspective almost, but from a political perspective, I don't think it's necessarily like correct. So basically my question is about like your research on the tenants union organizing in the 1970s, and any reflections on that in relation to the present day and politics.
Well, you can certainly ask a question, can't you? That's a tough one. So let's think about council housing for a start. So it kind of presents itself, certainly in 1945, and you know, and as a kind of universal model. So as housing that's available for everybody, and that you know, and Ira Bevan talks about, you know, the mixed communities and stuff like that. And at an early stage, you know, people I've talked to moved into council housing or were born in council housing in the 40s, 50s. They were living in the same street as their boss, you know, and you had, you know, teachers, you had manual workers living in the same housing. But what it never really does is go beyond the, you know, whatever name you want to put it, labor aristocracy, you know, the skilled working class and the skilled white working class. And it's very much in the hands of a state bureaucracy. So, I mean, housing kind of veers between, you know, kind of intrusive social work, you know, the likes of Octavia Hill, or, you know, the sort of like, you know, the city engineers who are only concerned with, you know, managing assets. And it never really, you know, so it never really became a mass tenure. Certainly, you know, if you were, you know, in an ethnic minority, if you were a single parent, you didn't have a chance of getting anywhere near council housing until the 1980s. And some estates, especially those built to replace, you know, sort of, you know, slum clearance, so-called slums, were stigmatized from the word go. You know, they were given a substandard service because they were seen as being, you know, the homes for people who didn't deserve them. So it's always been a stigmatized mass provision of housing. It was extraordinarily successful for one section of the working class, extraordinarily successful. So much so that they could be bought out under the right to buy. So, you know, I'm not trying to give a romanticized view of that. And I think any sort of like state service that is given to you is going to have problems. And I think that, so, but let's just take it as an economic model, as a financial model. So the sort of theory, the economic theory of cost rental, which works across, you know, social democratic Europe. You know, so if you have, you know, a public provision of housing, whether it's through municipalities or even trade unions or cooperatives, if you have a mass provision of housing that is, you know, regulated rent and regulated standards, it will outcompete on financial terms every other tenure. because it pays for itself, and then it starts accruing a surplus, and then you can lower rents even further, and you can increase standards, and then people will flock to that form of housing and they will leave the private rented sector. So in Britain, council housing reduced the private rental sector to 10%. You know, it's gone up now to 19%, so it's larger than social housing. But that's because we stopped building and we started to sort of starve out social housing. So social housing has this kind of economic model, which is extraordinarily successful, and it gives decent homes to people. We need to identify its problems. And that's why I was kind of waxing a little bit lyrical about things like cooperatives, because anything that actually involves people in the management and, you know, and running of their own homes and gives them that sort of like control over where they live, that's got to be encouraged. And so I wouldn't kind of turn my back on the council housing. To go answer your question about this sort of tenants organising, one of the interesting things there was that, you know, left-wing groups have always, you know, been involved in tenant action, and, you know, that's partly the success of rent strikes has been down to that. But they've also always had a kind of the ideal of what tenants should be doing and what their demands should be and stuff like that. And they've never been quite satisfied if they're not radical enough. Going back to my early point, you know, people, it's the people who should be leading this from the, you know, and learning, you know, at their own pace, not having something imposed on them. So I was always kind of quite depressed because my work was within residence groups who were kind of organising, you know, galas and children's activities. And you know, people said they're not radical enough. They should be having a rent strike. Yeah, they should be campaigning. If they don't have a placard in their hand, it's not good enough. What they were doing was creating, you know, a collective feeling on you know, in neighborhoods. They were creating this feeling that we actually share something in common, that we talk to each other, that we are a, you know, democratic society, that we belong together, that we have things in common. They were creating socialism from below. You know, you don't have to, you know, stand on a picket line to be doing that. All what we need to be doing is encouraging, you know, a feeling of collective and shared concern, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to ask myself. I want to ask a brief question of you both. We've got a couple more questions lined up which speak to this somewhat. One of the things that I got from, I mean, one of the obvious things that's coming out of this is the importance of a sense of community, a sense of solidarity, a sense of shared struggle, etc., a sense of empathy, perhaps. And I wondered, I mean, I'm certainly no expert on the housing question in any sense, and I defer to both of you here. But I wonder, given that social housing is often quite competitive, and maybe what you're arguing for here is a way beyond that competitive side, as in people competing for access to social housing, could that itself be an obstacle to people wanting social housing, but also an obstacle to fostering this sense of I would maybe even a class consciousness is what being discussed here. Imogen, would you like to start with that one? Is that okay? Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at council housing historically, it wasn't just for, you know, unemployed people or single mothers, but that's what it's turned into. You know, prior to the right to buy, it was housing for the working class, but you know, post that, it's become what I think some people would see as housing for an underclass, and has carried with it certain connotations that mean, you know, organising for the social housing has those connotations. But ask any 20-year-old that's going to be stuck in a rental market for the rest of their life, do you want cheap, good quality, affordable housing? Then they're going to say yes. So it's about how you frame things. And I guess coming back to how do we engage people in this question of housing? It's about asking the right questions, and it's about pulling it out of people. I mean, you know, part of a lot of what I do as an organizer is talk to people and try and find out what they care about, so I can say, all right, well, collectively we can try and solve this issue and do something about it. So, you know, the amount of conversations I've had on the street with 20-year-olds in this exact position, where it's going to create a sense of collectivity, because every person and their dog has had a dodgy landlord that has tried to screw them over.
Thank you for that, Imogen. Dr. Bradley.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And I mean, I think I was trying to say earlier that I don't think council housing is a rallying cry, really. I don't think it doesn't work for me. I don't think it works for anybody. And I think, you know, I think that was perhaps the problem with the manifesto that says we're going to build 100,000 council houses or something like that. For a start, you have to build more than 100,000, you know. You know, so we're not just talking about building, are we? We're talking about redistributing housing. You know, housing is the sign of inequality, the gaping inequality in our society. It's written right there on the street. You can just walk past a house and you can make a judgment about inequality, can't you? And that's how we see things. And it's about changing that. And it's about changing that in terms of what people need and what people want. So Imogen's absolutely right. If you say to somebody, would you like, you know, a fair rent, you know, would you like a secure tenancy? Would you like, you know, to have a landlord that knew what they were doing and was responsive, you know, and he was at the end of a telephone line, or still better, you know, just down the road in an office? You know, would you like to have, you know, to be able to direct the, you know, repairs budget? Would you like to have a say over your homes and the conditions of your homes? And would you like that to be improved constantly? You know, so let's strip that down to what is the offer? What is the thing that we actually want? Now, so I don't want to say, yeah, well, look, it's over here in council housing, because it isn't really, you know. I mean, you know, we can, you know, as Imogen said, it's all been kind of like, you know, sort of smeared all over. So we can't get a complete picture anymore. So let's go back to, you know, what is it that we need out of housing, you know, and let's promote those things. So we should have, and that's why I suppose I was using, you know, universal rights and human rights as a kind of, you know, tool for this. Because we can all, I think, agree on what the criteria for decent homes, you know, would be, and it's about kind of, so who's going to provide that? You know, it's not going to be the state, and the state never, you know, never does anything unless, you know, mass movements of people force it to. So that's where we need to be. We need to go beyond, you know, having renters unions and having, you know, tenants associations here and having kind of campaign groups over here. We have got to have one big, you know, noisy, global housing rights campaign.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bradley. We have a question from Megan Asplin. Megan, would you like to unmute? Megan? Here we go.
Sorry, it was taking a while. My question is mainly aimed at Imogen, but Quintin, you can answer this as well if you would like. Within your talk, you link the housing organisation to labour organisation, and I feel a bit uneasy about that. So my question is, do you not think it's a little bit problematic to link the two organising, because that excludes the most vulnerable within this conversation, especially like the unemployed? In COVID, we've seen a lot of redundancies, and with those redundancies, of course, comes uncertainty with your housing.
Yeah. So I think during the COVID crisis, obviously there's been mass unemployment, you know, and there needs to be some sort of organising around that, around unemployment. You know, we can look back in history about unemployed workers movements, and that should absolutely happen. But I think when it comes to thinking about how to organise and how to organise for power quickly, so that we can win material change in a moment of absolute crisis, we got to be smart about it. Like, some of the poorest and most oppressed workers sometimes aren't the smartest group of workers to organise, or the smartest people to organise, and that's fine. But I think as socialists, we do have to think about the wider picture, and that's what we've been doing for ages. You know, some of the best organised sectors are the railway sector and the dockers, and there's a reason for that, because it's smart and it's strategic, and people face, you know, housing issues go across the world, and I'd love for us to be able to organise globally, but we just don't have the time and resources. We've just got to choose how we can win power and do it quickly. And if you look at some of the sort of like most sexy organising campaigns globally that are winning big, it's when they unite the sort of socially reproductive issues around housing, around school funding, and workers' interests, and that's how you can change cities. I mean, look at the Glasgow women's strike. You know, that was uniting the issue of gender equality and wages and the conditions of public sector workers, and they built power like in a couple of years, and they had 10,000 women going out on strike, and it was incredible. So, you know, we can't assign ourselves to being what's the word? I mean, I just think, you know, we have to be smart if we want to build power quick and change things.
Thank you, Imogen. Megan wants to come back in and respond, if that's okay. Megan.
I appreciate your passion for the strikes and the movements, and you're talking about winning power, but other than the goal of whatever that strike is, has it really done anything to further a total left movement or a socialist movement?
I think the question of is how transformative class struggle can be is a question that's plagued socialists and communists for too long, but I think it's the best tool that we have, and yeah, you know, I've had, you know, one of the first strikes that I organised, I was organising these workers. It was amazing. We were on the picket lines together. They were, you know, raring to go. And I went back to the same hospital 3 months later and spoke to these workers about the election. And I was like, are you going to vote for Corbyn? And they were like, oh, definitely not. You know, he's a Marxist and an anti-Semite, and you know that process, it hadn't happened, and it was destroyed me. But I think you know, historically it is the best tool that we have, and I don't know what the alternative would be.
Thank you, Imogen. Megan, is that okay? Yeah. I just noticed that you were still on. I wondered if you wanted to come
no, I
back.
hadn't turned myself off yet.
That's fine. It's all good. Dr. Bradley, if you had any remarks there, you're most welcome to share them.
Oh, just to join in, I suppose. I really like the word union. I mean, I like that that we've got renters unions. I used to organise a claimants union, you know, so unemployed workers. And if you think about what the word union conveys, so that sort of collectivity, that solidarity, that feeling of being together, of struggling together, of learning together. You know, and we don't work in, you know, in the ways that we used to, where you could have mass workplaces and organize everybody. And yet, you know, people are still successfully organizing the most marginal and the most disadvantaged workers, or they are successfully organizing themselves, to be more accurate. You know, and there's something just in that whole spirit, you know, that this is what we need to I think, some sort of these basic kind of concepts that we need to reawaken, you know, and we need to build our spirit on that. And that's the idea of union and of unity. You know, I know it may sound hackneyed, but let's cut out all that kind of, you know, let's go back to what it actually really means. Thank you.
I keep missing the unmute button. Thank you. Okay, we have another question from Anthony. Anthony says, could you expand on the politics 2008 downturn? I remember this was mentioned about half an hour ago, wasn't it, about the idea of it differing somehow from what happened in 2008. Housing was at the center of this crisis. And while there were efforts to organize around preventing evictions, what was notable in the US was the rise of Occupy on the one hand and the Tea Party on the other, and their complaint that Americans were being forced to bail out people living beyond their means. One might argue the right response to the crisis prevailed. That is, the right-wing response to the crisis prevailed. Would you agree? And if you do, why did they fail to lead through this crisis? And how is what's happening now different? Dr. Bradley, if you'd like to take the lead on this one, please.
I think Anthony put his hand up, maybe.
Did he?
Oh yeah, I can unmute. Great. Yeah,
Oh.
just to clarify, I was listening to the Obama years, a kind of PBS special, and there it was the Tea Party's claim that people were living beyond their means, not Occupy, but twin phenomena and the politics that emerged afterwards. It's kind of hard to trace back to the anti-eviction movement, like that was there in 2008, 2009. That sort of disappeared into other things. And I just want to, and the other thing that seems to have been, you know, really remarkable about that time is the rise of new right-wing politics rather than left-wing politics. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
So I think that's the sort of overall narrative, isn't it, of the rise of populism. I think my take on this would be, so if you look at North America, you look at the USA, you've got anti-eviction struggles writ large now, and you've got some really imaginative strategies, so mass squatting, but also kind of like, you know, sort of like in the margins of legality, so reclaiming homes, homesteading, as they're calling it, you know, sort of like a conjuring up pictures of the frontier. So, you know, getting to the kind of heart of that kind of American culture in you know, actions against foreclosure. And I think really, if you could think about the scale of the 2008, you know, to 2012 global crash, you know, people, as you know, in Spain and USA, whole areas, neighborhoods were foreclosed, you know, just boarded up houses, street after street, huge homelessness encampments on the edge of every single city. The same in, you know, so it's very difficult to fight back at a time of loss, of huge, heartrending loss. And it takes years for you to just get your feet back onto the ground and then to start fighting back. I think that's kind of what we've seen. You know, the 2008, you know, the crash was the time when companies like Blackstone just bought up all those foreclosed houses and turned them into rental units. It was that moment of opportunity for global capital. And it was a defeat, you know, a defeat for the labor movement. And I think definitely that allowed space for, you know, a very hard-edged right-wing movement to emerge and to you know, claim that it was speaking for and acting in the interests of that disenfranchised class when it was clearly doing no such thing. But I think, you know, I think, well, I hope I detect a change in that, a change in the sophistication and the imagination of housing action struggles across the globe. And I think, you know, don't back a losing horse. I think the time of change is hopefully on us.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley. Imogen, please.
So yeah, I mean, how it can differ now, I think it's not going to, you know, it's going to be more of the rental market rather than the mortgage market that are going to face evictions. And I think, you know, if we look at the UK context, I think the housing movement is a lot more organised than it was 10 years ago. We look at the organisations that we have in the UK organising around housing. We've got Acorn, we've got Tenants Union UK, who do have, you know, branches across the country that have been trading in eviction resistance, and you know, are prepared to do that. And if we look at that housing movement, those activists have come out of the 2008 financial crash and who came out of the student movement, and they're now organising around housing. You know, not all of them, but it's a lot of the same people, and that movement is just a lot more organised. So I think, you know, we will see more eviction resistance and that becoming more popular, and people seeing the validity of joining their local tenants union, and getting involved with that.
Thank you, Imogen. I've got a question that I want to ask myself now. Not ask myself, you know what I mean. I phrased that really weirdly. I wanted to say that, because I think the conversation has come around to this somewhat, I sympathise with both of you that reforms are not always in vain. And I know, Dr. Bradley, you were emphasising this, that it's not always just about, you know, a revolutionary movement or whatever. I do think reforms are valuable, both when they help people in the immediate sense and when they contribute within a broader context of a socialist or labour movement. However, I wondered from both of you if you thought there's any way in which reforms, even good-natured reforms, could end up becoming obstacles or could even retard a movement. Even reforms that set out to help people, could they have an adverse effect in any way? Dr. Bradley, if you'd like to start us with this one, please.
Well, you know, I'm really, really old, and the trouble with being old is you just remember things in the past. And so I spent most of my youth campaigning against the welfare state, you know, really, honestly, social workers, line them up against the wall. You know, really, council housing, it's disgusting. Get rid of it. And then, you know, then I find myself defending every last council house, defending social workers, defending the professions, defending the public services. So we need more public services. So that was pretty clever of me, really, wasn't it? So, yeah, I mean, I think with hindsight, it's like, you know, so you spend the 1960s fighting against consumerism, and now I'm just desperate for minimum wage, you know? So reforms, it's, you know, you have this perspective, don't you? The reforms are absolutely what is desperately needed when, you know, you desperately need help. But you also need to be able to see beyond that. So you need to be able to see the limits of, you know, of just getting enough to eat, of just getting a decent wage, of just getting a decent home. You know, that's what we're fighting for now. And what we need is beyond that, you know, so what we need beyond that is some sort of society where there's meaning for people's lives, where people can develop, you know, and live proper, you know, really exciting lives, you know. But at the moment, we're just clinging on. And, you know, we've got to reach that stage. And but I think one of the routes to that stage, you know, I think is kind of the avenue that Imogen is pointing out is together. You know, we will gather that enthusiasm together. You know, there's nothing like giving meaning to people's lives when they're up against a real fight, you know, against a multinational company or something like that. You know, struggle, you know, does give you, you know, bit of adventure. It gives you the feeling that, you know, there is something, you know, something more than just existing from day to day.
Thank you, Dr. Bradley. Imogen, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, I remember reading In Against the State by John McDonnell a couple of years ago. And just to sort of riff off of what Quintin was saying, I remember reading it and thinking, like, this is what you're bothered about? Like, he talks about what society's like in the 70s and about all these great, you know, all these public services and council housing and social workers. And I'm just here thinking, oh my God, like, that would be great, and you're complaining about it. It just reminded me of that, and it's quite funny. You know, there's always going to be issues around, you know, sort of reformists and state intervention solutions to the, you know, housing crises, health, you know, all these things. But yeah, you know, just access to the basic necessities of life. So, you know, for God's sake, we had to have a pandemic before the Tories even conceded temporarily. You know, this is just temporary. Furlough, the ability to furlough and some sort of social security provisions. That, you know, social welfare provisions even. You know, I've lived through austerity. I don't know anything different, and I think same could be said for a large proportion of the people the same age as me. And you know, we do need reforms right now because things are pretty bad.
Okay, thank you, Imogen. I don't think we have any more questions. So what I would like to do is just to invite you both to just give some closing remarks. And then I'm going to just close the session up with my own closing remarks, if that's okay. So yeah, Dr. Bradley, if you would like to give your closing remarks, if that's okay.
Thanks, man. I feel like I've talked far too much anyway and rabbited on and droned on, but you know, I suppose I think the kind of things I suppose I'm talking about is that I have quite a lot of hope that, you know, that housing campaigns are now growing in sophistication. I have hope that we are realizing that we are in a global housing crisis, and that there are links being made across the globe between activists and campaigners. I have hope also that kind of, you know, that we are returning to some sort of debate about you know, the social need, about what we actually need as a society, what are the minimum standards, if you like, that is applied particularly to housing and to neighborhoods. I think that's positive. I think the scale of the struggle that we're up against, I mean, you know, it's really handy to have evil companies like Blackstone, because you can just, you know, it's like you're being in a James Bond film. You can just say, they're evil. And they are, that's true. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. And, you know, so the scale of the struggle is just amazingly intense. And what we would need, you know, if you think about it, if to give everybody a decent home, that's not just about building homes, that's about redistributing homes. It's about ending second homes. It's about closing down Airbnb, you know. It's about major changes that, you know, they would need you know, a political party in government to bring about, but that would never happen unless you constantly had a mass movement that was on the streets pushing them into action. But it's also a fact that we've got to get people around a set of, you know, a set of beliefs, a vision that speaks to people, and that, you know, that gives people hope, because you won't get anywhere by urging self-sacrifice. As Imogen says, you know, we've lost so much, but, you know, we need something inspirational now. And I think, you know, renters unions, you know, housing campaigns, housing rights, universal human rights, that can inspire.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bradley. And Imogen, if you'd like to close us up, please.
Yeah, I've just got this like wonderful image of all these housing movements like converging and like being a mass demonstration and us taking the city and it being beautiful. Yeah, you know, I think to sort of end on like, yeah, convergence of movements and particularly, you know, in light of a pandemic, is absolutely essential and a really important part of the strategic puzzle for socialists, because it is an issue that affects so many people, that does appeal to their interests, their direct interests, their immediate interests. When, you know, people are being threatened with the potential for eviction, as so many people have lost their jobs and are struggling to pay the rent. I mean, you know, the eviction ban has only been put down for a couple more months, and we are going to see that the effects of that. You know, we're already seeing the effects of that people are being evicted despite the laws. And you know, there does need to be a really, really smart response from you know, impending waves of austerity that are inevitably going to come after this pandemic. And yeah, so.
Thank you very much. Well, this was my first time moderating a panel, and I've had a blast. You've both been brilliant. Thank you very much to both of you. I'd just like to finish up with the usual, you know, PR stunts here. At 11 p.m. tonight, we actually have another event, although this is not obviously hosted by Manchester, because we wouldn't choose 11 p.m. at night. It's Platypus Virginia is hosting an event, The Future After the Election, What's Left. Then tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. UK time, Platypus LSE is having a teach-in by Richard Rubin, Engels at 200 on the dialectics of nature. And just to say as well, Platypus Manchester's regular activities, just to reinforce this, our reading group is on Tuesdays at 6 p.m. We will be reading a section of Georg Lukács's History and Class Consciousness on Tuesday. We've got another few weeks left of that. We've got our regular coffee breaks on Fridays, and hopefully, all being well, when COVID is over, we'll be having ever more in-person events. But yeah, thank you very much to both of you. Usually this is where we all applaud and I end the call, and yeah. So thank you very much. And yeah, have a good night.